Welcome back to today's video. Today is Tuesday, December 19th, 2023, and today we're going to be taking a look at a New York Times Siena College poll, one that I think personally is very interesting and provides us a lot of context about what a Joe Biden victory on the national level might look like and what numbers could suggest that Joe Biden is on track for victory in 2024. Now, before this video gets started, I want to say that I'm not doing this video to ignore the significant amount of polls that are showing Donald Trump with a lead nationally. This poll struck out to me in specific because there were some very fascinating crosstabs alongside a difference between the regular registered voters pool and the likely voters pool. Now, historically speaking, Democrats have done better amongst registered voters and Republicans have done better amongst likely voters. That's why in low turnout elections, the voters that are most likely to turn out typically vote more red. But specifically in this new New York Times Siena College poll, we've seen now that the likely voter pool is in fact more likely to vote for President Biden, contrary to the registered voter pool. I think this in specific is very, very interesting because it's a change of what we historically have known to be the reality of our elections and the way that turnout works and the way that both parties appeal to different groups of people. Now, I think this isn't necessarily too shocking, looking at polls that question people who have actually paid attention to the news rather than those who do not. You often find that Democrats start to do better amongst voting groups that have paid more attention to the news. Largely speaking, Joe Biden's administration has done a lot of things that I think a lot of people, based off of actual polls, seem to approve of. But the messaging strategy behind it, the communication strategy behind it, does not seem to be effective enough in the way that the American public simply does not approve of the job that Joe Biden is doing. Even though there are numbers out there that show that President Biden's approval might be higher on certain issues like infrastructure or healthcare or abortion, on the high level, he's unpopular. And that's something that Democrats need to combat. But looking at this poll from the New York Times, I want to point out the interesting facts of it all. We're going to go through the top lines here to just talk about what they decide to be the most important parts of it, and then dive deep into what we've seen from political betting markets, what we've seen from historical polls, what we've seen from recent elections, and come up with a general idea and a general consensus here about how Joe Biden can win in the 2024 election and what specifically this poll has to say that helps us get to that point. So let's start off by taking a look at just the high-level takeaways here. Donald Trump leads Joe Biden 46 to 44% amongst registered voters. Amongst likely voters, that is different. It's 47 to 45%. So looking at these questions here, depending on who's more likely to vote or not, that's where you really start to see, are people enthusiastic about this election? Well, the takeaway is largely not, right? A lot of people are going to vote. Almost certain is at 53%, very likely is at 29%, 10% is somewhat likely, and only around 8% of the electorate doesn't know or is not very likely or not at all likely to vote in the upcoming election. That's good. At least on that basis alone, a significant chunk of registered voters already want to get out to the ballot box. That's good for democracy and America in general. But in terms of political leaning, historically that was good for Democrats, and now it presently is not. If the 2024 presidential election were held today, who would you vote for if the candidates were Joe Biden or Donald Trump? Now, this includes all questions, all answers. Yes, I'm voting for Trump, maybe, but I'm leaning towards Donald Trump. Combining it together, the vote share here is 46 to 44. A whopping 9%, though, don't know, refused, or are undecided on that front. That's interesting. Around 10% of the electorate hasn't made up their minds about two candidates that they've seen on the ballot not only once, but now twice, and for the case of Donald Trump, a third time since 2016. If the 2024 presidential election was held today, this question has been asked multiple times. You see here that the candidates being chosen and the numbers being chosen here have been decreasing for people who are very solid about either side of the aisle. This takes away leaners, meaning it's not the people who are saying, I'm iffy about this, but I lean towards Donald Trump. Taking them out of the equation, this really helps gauge the amount of enthusiasm, the energy around candidates, and we see that we have seen a dramatic decrease specifically for President Biden, but also somewhat of a decrease for President Trump compared to where he was around 6 months ago. So in this July poll done just this year, Joe Biden had 43% of voters saying that they were voting for him. If they had to decide today, who were they going to vote for, taking out the lean, right? Not saying you're undecided, pressing you out now. Who are you thinking about voting for 2024? Today, about 39% of people say Joe Biden. 43% said Joe Biden back in July. You look at Donald Trump on the other hand. He's at 41% today. Okay, a bit of a decrease from where he was at 43%. But the point is that both candidates have seen a decrease. Joe Biden, the most notable decrease. Because back in September of 2022, around a year and 2 months ago, right before the 2022 midterms, Joe Biden's numbers were at 45%. Donald Trump, on the other hand, was 42%. And today, even, the highest percentage of people are saying another candidate. There's not too much of a difference, though, in terms of those who are saying they're not going to vote or they wouldn't vote if those are their two choices, which is actually somewhat good news for Democrats and Republicans, but we can't really figure out which side of the aisle benefits from that. But right now, Joe Biden is at a decrease there. And so if they weren't supporting either of the two candidates, this is also where it becomes quite interesting. If you had to decide between the two today, would you lean towards more Joe Biden or towards Donald Trump? And this is where you start to see Biden pick up that pace from that 39% compared to Trump's 41%, but it still doesn't do too much. And the interesting thing, too, is that historically speaking, both, Biden and Democrats in 22 and 2020 have been able to benefit from this group of people who were not supporting either. The only time this benefited Donald Trump was in the 2016 election, and it was quite substantial in terms of how the difference was there. But Joe Biden getting just 26% of people who are being pressed out to say, if you had to decide between the two today, shows a significant decrease in support. Because right now, Donald Trump is building up to the numbers that he was at in 2020. Joe Biden is significantly underperforming them. Now, the crosstabs here also show some interesting results. I want to look at that, especially amongst likely voters, because it helps tell us exactly how Joe Biden has this pathway to victory. We've looked at some of the major questions. We've seen some of the changes between now and previous months' polls, but the likely electorate is the one where Joe Biden leads Donald Trump. So let's think about and explore how this actually happens. So in terms of who people are backing, you find that a significant chunk of women are supporting Joe Biden and a significant chunk of men are supporting Donald Trump. That is the general breakdown we often see. Women are a little bit more lopsided in favor of supporting Democrats. Men are still lopsided, but less so in supporting Donald Trump. And that's where Joe Biden comes out ahead nationally. Turnout amongst men and women is roughly even nationwide, and the general population of the United States is also roughly even. In terms of age groupings, though, 18 to 29 is the one that I am so fascinated about, because just 47% of young voters here are saying that they are voting for Joe Biden, contrary to 44% saying Donald Trump. Now, to put that into perspective, the last election, Joe Biden won this same electorate by around 20 points. So how is Joe Biden still leading against Donald Trump? Well, number one, only about 13% of the electorate is actually young voters, and the amount that actually votes is even less likely. On top of that, taking a look at older voting groups, Joe Biden, surprisingly enough, does quite well. 30 to 44-year-olds, 53 to 42. 65 plus, 52 to 41. Meaning that if Joe Biden wants a decisive victory in 2024, he maintains his numbers amongst older voters while winning over younger voters yet again. And so looking also at nationality, race, and ethnicity, you see here that Joe Biden wins minority voters by a pretty substantial margins. Voters that don't categorize as either black or Hispanic but are minorities, 53 to 33. Hispanic voters, it has narrowed up to 47-35, but still a substantial lead for President Biden. And the black voting group, which Democrats and Republicans thought there was some major movement on, the New York Times Siena College poll seems to suggest that it hasn't changed too substantially. Donald Trump has seen a slight uptick in support for minority groups, similar to what it was in 2020, with Joe Biden getting 82% of black voters here and 13% for Donald Trump. But looking at the minority voting groups, contrary to the white voting groups, you see that there is a huge difference there. The only racial group that Democrats lose consistently are white voters, which means Democrats need to drive up turnout amongst minority voters, which again is interesting. That the likely voting group is more likely to vote for Biden because historically speaking, minority voters are not the most likely group to turn out to vote. The other interesting thing, too, is that young voters, as I already mentioned, are not backing President Biden in the way they did in the last election, or even backed Hillary Clinton in the 2016 election. That's something that Democrats can work to improve upon and tells us that there is room for movement in the upward direction for President Biden. Now, this is just one singular poll. Taking it a step out, we have to understand this is a singular voting poll, right? This is not perfect. It actually is in contrary with a lot of the numbers that we're seeing nationally, but it is so meticulously done. It is a very reputable pollster. And the numbers here seem to suggest, too, that it is within the margin of error. So there is, again, room for movement. And so looking at the numbers beyond just gender, age, race, education, whatever it might be, we can also take a look, too, at what we're looking at with education level. That's really interesting. What most issues are facing, what What is the most important problem facing the country today? Questions around that. The job approval rating, too. And what we find here, too, is that the net approve and disapprove, very different than what people are voting on election day, right? 47% of this likely voting group are saying they're voting for Biden. Just 39% say they approve of the job he's doing as president. Just 14% say they strongly approve, right? That's in contrary with 43% saying they strongly disapprove. Now, in terms of those who strongly disapprove, let's take a look at where some of these areas are the strongest. Young voters, where you really should be seeing President Biden's numbers doing well, he's disapproved of. 27% say somewhat disapprove, 40% say strongly disapprove, 67% on the net, the highest of any grouping. 67% of young voters say they disapprove of the job that Joe Biden is doing. Think about that for a moment. Every other age group, 30 to 44, 45 to 64, 65 plus, 56%, 63%, 47%. It is not nearly as high as where we are amongst young voters. And that's a problem for the Democratic Party. But looking at where we are, not only here in the age grouping, but also minority voters too. Let's talk about voters of color, right? The white electorate here, 62% net disapprove. Amongst black voters, just 25%. Hispanic voters, 54%, and other, 64%. That's where the highest is. So you are finding that the highest voting group that seems to disapprove of President Biden amongst age are younger voters. Amongst race and ethnicity are still some minority group. That is where you see a collapse in President Biden's numbers. A collapse that might not exist come Election Day 2024. And this is where you see rooms for improvement for the Democratic Party. This is why we have seen this substantial collapse in support for President Biden nationally. It's because young voters are turning away from him. They're disapproving of the job he's doing. Some minority groups are also turning away from him, disapproving of the job he's doing. But in the event that there are the likeliest voters out there, Joe Biden can still win. It also shows, like I was just saying, where that room for improvement needs to be made. Where the Democratic Party can win back voters they won in 16, in 18, in 20, in 22, and can again in 2024. There are some substantial problems facing the presidency right now, facing Joe Biden's position, Joe Biden's electability for 2024. Whether it's the conflict in the Middle East, whether it's the southern border, whether it's foreign relations outside of what's happening in the Middle East. There are plenty of things at play that are showing young voters that President Biden isn't exactly a good president in their eyes, right? So that's what they're seeing. That's what they're taking away from the news that they're seeing, the consumption on social media. There is a huge reason why young voters are turning away from Biden, but they're not turning away from him in favor of Trump in large droves. Yes, the numbers are there, and yes, people are very unhappy with him, but that isn't to say that they cannot be won back. The problem for Joe Biden is that he's not meeting the mark where he was in the last election. Donald Trump is only slightly improving off where he was. Joe Biden is just substantially underperforming what his numbers were. But voters have already backed Biden once, and they can back him again. Donald Trump is reaching a hurdle, whereas max here in some of these polls is 48%, 47% on average. That's the highest he's ever been since the 2016 presidential election. And even then, on election day, he didn't receive 47% of the vote. Joe Biden, on the other hand, has a lot more to work back up to. He has a higher metric that he has achieved before, the Democrats have achieved before, and can absolutely do. And if anyone calls into question, is it possible to win on the national map with a popular vote margin such as this one for the GOP? Just ask the Democrats in 2022. Because the answer is probably yes, especially in some battleground states like Pennsylvania and Georgia and Arizona and Nevada. And another question too, have these polls been wrong before? We'll just take a look at what the final polls suggested might be the map based on the 2022 data. That we would see Republican victories in Nevada, in Arizona, in Pennsylvania, in Georgia, none of which happened on the Senate map. You take a look at the governor's map. They suggested that Republicans would win Arizona. Didn't happen. The Republicans would win Wisconsin. Didn't happen, right? The Republicans would win Kansas. Didn't happen. A lot of these states were suggested by the polls or predicted based on data from the polls, like Michigan going red based off of an adjusted margin from the 2020 election. Well, newsflash, sometimes polls are wrong, and they aren't always favoring Democrats. In some cases, like 2022, they overwhelmingly favored Republicans. That might be the case of what's happening in 2024. I'm not here to ignore a lot of the data that suggests that Donald Trump is in a good position. I've already made a video recently talking about how Donald Trump today is the favorite to win the election. But at the end of the day, the numbers that are revealed in the New York Times Siena College crosstabs in the high-level takeaways is that young voters and minority voters show the biggest areas where the Democratic Party can make an improvement. Because if Biden is somehow, miraculously to his campaign's advantage, winning over older voters, younger voters, absolutely, we can see a reversion in favor of President Biden. Because we saw a similar thing happening around 4 years ago today, around actually 3 years and 10 months ago today, when it looked like Joe Biden was going to win South Carolina and eventually the nomination. Around that time, you saw a significant dip in support amongst young voters, but not a dip that wasn't able to be made up between then and Election Day, because once that general election starts, once we actually see a Trump v. Biden rematch, we will likely see very different numbers than what we are seeing today. Now, whether that's in favor of Trump more or in favor of Biden more, we don't know. But there clearly is a pathway of victory for President Biden, and it all lies in minority and younger voters turning them out to vote and changing their perception about the presidency and who they vote for in the general election. So thank you guys so much for watching this video. Make sure to comment down suggestions below. Subscribe on the left if you haven't already, and check out the Instagram and Twitter. At the bottom left of the screen, there's also a Discord server for you to go ahead and join. On the screen, there's a video you can watch, and then a playlist for my 2024 presidential election analysis videos. Again, thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you all tomorrow.